And it is now my pleasure to introduce our final program here in the morning. The founder and longtime CEO of America Online, the former chairman of AOL Time Warner, the CEO of Revolution, the chairman of Startup America, and a member of the President's Job Council. Everyone, Steve Case.
Alan, nice to see you.
So, just with that introduction, that's a lot of hats. That's a public policy hat, it's a nonprofit hat, and obviously all the work you're doing as an entrepreneur in investing. How do these all sort of fit together? What's the big vision?
Well, first of all, it's great to see everybody here, particularly after this has been a rather lengthy but fun DC week, celebrating entrepreneurship, a lot of different events, but it's great to end focusing on some of these policy issues, and it's great to see Tom Khalil from the White House and Mark Warner and others, Tom Davis, who've been focused both on entrepreneurship and on bipartisan. In terms of what unifies all these things, whether it be the Revolution investments or Startup America or the policy work, it's really trying to make sure we remain the world's most entrepreneurial nation. I think it's really important. I think it's how we became the leading economy in the world. It wasn't just like by accident. It was the work of entrepreneurs creating not just companies but industries, and that kind of took what was a startup. The United States was a startup 200 plus years ago, and now it's a kind of the leader of the free world. That's because of the work of entrepreneurs, and other nations are stepping up their efforts around capital, around talent, things like immigration policy, around research, and have kind of figured out that the secret sauce that's powered the American economy is entrepreneurship, and trying to kind of do more of that in their countries. So I think it's important that we shine a spotlight on it. It's important that we make sure, particularly folks in Washington, are making policy, kind of recognize why it is so important, why it is so urgent. And so that's really what unifies all of them. I think if it was just focused on the policy side, my head would probably explode because it is, I really respect people who are willing to, jump into that, get it, but it's tough. But we got a little progress, as Senator Warner talked about, with this Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, crowdfunding and IPO on ramp, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress on Startup Act 2.0, particularly high-skilled immigration. I think the Startup America effort and your leadership in Startup DC and as a Startup Maryland here and others as well is how do you build up the regional ecosystems all around the country. That's kind of where the action is. You got to have the right national policy, but the action is really going to be in the regions. And I think that's an important effort, partly to broaden entrepreneurship around the country so it's less reliant on Silicon Valley or a few other places and more evenly spread. And entrepreneurs all around the nation have more of a shot than they otherwise would. And then finally, with Revolution, it's sort of working directly with companies that we believe can change the world and trying to provide some of the capital they need, but also some help in terms of thinking about how to scale those companies. One I just came from this morning was Living Social had a kind of a company meeting, and it's a great example. Obviously, particularly in DC, when we invested in it, it was 4 people. Now there's over 4,000 people, and they've created a real significant global company in like 4 years. And that's where job creation comes from. That's where economic growth comes from. That's where competitiveness comes from. It's all around entrepreneurship.
I read the statistic that in 4 years, Living Social's gone from not existing to being one of the top 10 private employers in the city.
Right.
Mind-blowing. So you've been writing a lot, and I know the senator alluded to some of the writing you've been doing about this. So the rise of the rest.
Right.
What is the rise of the rest, and what does it mean to DC, but what does it mean to the whole country?
Well, I should first say I stole the phrase from Fareed Zakaria, who basically wrote a book talking about the rise of the rest globally. And basically his thesis was the United States could continue to be a strong nation, but its relative strength would shift over time as other nations, China, India, and others, were rising up. And so it sort of changes the global kind of balance, if you will, which doesn't mean that anybody is falling, but others are rising. And I think the similar dynamic is beginning to happen, and I think hopefully will happen more over the next 10 or 20 years in the United States. And Silicon Valley is the pride and joy of the United States, the envy of the world, is sort of this, the most robust entrepreneurial ecosystem, and it's fabulous. It's awesome, and a lot of great companies are started there and scaled there. But not all great companies are started and scaled there, and the story of our American entrepreneurship is a broader-based story. If you go travel around the country, I've done a fair amount lately, each of the cities that kind of became prominent on the back of an industry that grew there that was started by entrepreneurs. I was in Detroit last month, and Detroit was Silicon Valley 50 years ago. That really was the industry of the moment, kind of cars, and that was the epicenter of innovation globally in Detroit. That's why Detroit blossomed, and when that industry fell off, I think they lost like half of their population over the last 30 or 40 years because the industry fell. This shows you the rise and fall of regions, and based on the rise and fall of companies, based on the rise and fall of what's happening, particularly around entrepreneurship. So building up these other regions and having a more evenly dispersed American entrepreneurial ecosystem, I think, is critically important. Now, the positive there is it's not starting from scratch. Talk about Living Social in D.C. We also invest in a company called Revolution Money in Tampa, Florida, and Zipcars in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Things we haven't invested in, like Under Armour, it's in Baltimore, very successful athletic wear company. Chipotle, I'm sure you're all familiar with. That's a $12 billion market value company. They're in Denver. Recently with the founder of Chobani Yogurt. Didn't exist 5 years ago. It's now $1 billion business. They're in upstate New York. This is, kind of, there are examples of this. We just want to have it be not one here and one there, but a more developed portfolio of great high growth companies in regions all around the country. So that's sort of the idea of the rise to rest, which is not to say anything negative at all about Silicon Valley. It is, as I said, awesome, but it is to say as a nation, if we're going to have a stronger economic growth rate, we're going to have lower levels of unemployment, we're going to ensure we're competitive globally, we've got to have a more evenly dispersed entrepreneurship ecosystem across the nation as opposed to be overly reliant on a few places.
So one of the big accomplishments of the last year was working to actually get legislation passed by Congress, bipartisan legislation. You worked with Senator Warner, you worked with Eric Cantor, and you actually got the Jobs Act passed. That often in our community sort of gets distilled down to, just sort of crowdfunding. Could you actually sort of lay out, like, what are all the different components of the Jobs Act that are important to the entrepreneurial community?
Well, I probably should, first of all, I hopefully catalyze them, but ultimately it's the folks in Congress, folks in the White House who did it. And they had to decide it was important. They had to, come together, and my role was really more just encouraging and trying to kind of build some relationships. The backdrop of this is about 2 years ago, I was asked to co-chair an initiative called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship as part of the Commerce Department, and put a group together and laid out a few different priorities. One was celebrating entrepreneurship, which actually ended up leading to discussions of the White House and under the leadership of Tom Khalil and ultimately the president. That really helped get the Startup America process going within the government and creating a Startup America partnership as a kind of private sector, independent, nonpartisan kind of efforts. The celebration was one issue. Capital, access to capital was another issue that led to a series of discussions around a variety of different potential initiatives with the Treasury Department and others. And finally, commercialization. What can we do? We spent $150 billion as a nation on research. How can we make sure more of that comes out of the labs and into the marketplace in terms of putting things in the hand of entrepreneurs? So we kind of set that up. And that then, as I said, led to the Startup America effort. And about the same time, the president decided to create this Jobs Council that Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, chairs. And I was asked to join that and kind of lead the entrepreneurship effort as part of that. And to the president's credit, it was a bipartisan group as well. Jeff is a Republican, and he was chairing this initiative. So I think it was a good thing to see that kind of focus on the issue. And through that effort, we then laid out what we thought was sort of a roadmap to get entrepreneurship on track, or accelerate, I should say, and make sure we remain the world's most entrepreneurial country. And we presented that roadmap to the president about a year ago. And one of the key aspects related to capital, and that led to discussions with folks in the House and the Senate, obviously the White House as well, which ultimately led to this Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act. And it really was focused on capital. So there are multiple ingredients. The crowdfunding, I think, is important. Senator Warner made the key point there, which is it's particularly important to entrepreneurs in regions and sectors that are underserved, or in some cases unserved, by venture capital or angel groups or what have you, which is a lot of the country. Those ideas now have at least a shot. Doesn't mean they'll all get funded. Doesn't mean they'll all be successful. Obviously, many will fail, but at least they'll have a shot to get funding. And then the on-ramp for IPOs was the second key piece. But everything related to access to capital. The reason why the Startup Act 2.0 is so important is that it deals with some other issues, immigration being the most important, in my opinion, but also things related to regulation, investment incentives, some of the commercialization of research issues. So now that really is the priority going forward. So it's sort of an evolution over a couple of years, but ultimately these things, you can make recommendations, but somebody has to take them and run with them. And you have to basically get people to believe it is important, it is urgent, and that they agree on a general solution, and then build bipartisan support for it. So I give a lot of credit to the president for kind of putting this in place. I give a lot of credit to Eric Cantor, the majority leader of the House, who kind of took it and ran with it. And it was great to see them working together on something in a bipartisan way. And then it did pass both the Senate and the House, relatively quickly with broad bipartisan, kind of support. I think about 80% of people, supported it. So that's good. One example of bipartisanship in a tough, kind of election year. Good. One step forward in terms of making sure we have the right policies around entrepreneurship. But there's, still more to be done. And as Senator Warner said, it's also implementing the Jobs Act, particularly getting the SEC to put the right regulations in place around crowdfunding, not too much, not too little, just right, so that it gives entrepreneurs the ability to use these technologies, these capabilities to raise money to get a company started and create jobs, but also does it in a way that protects investors and minimizes fraud. That's really the trick. So there's still work to be done.
Excellent. So switching gears a little bit, we've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience. You have a famously successful entrepreneur yourself. Built America Online, most valuable stock in the 1990s, still I think the largest acquisition in history. What advice do you have? What lessons have you learned through 20 years of doing that for a lot of these new entrepreneurs that are just getting started here in the region?
Well, I've learned a lot. But ultimately, I think it comes down to, it's sort of simplistic, but I think it's important to be successful as an entrepreneur. You've got to have the right people. You've got to be really passionate about it. And you've got to persevere. So I think of them as 3 Ps: people, passion, and perseverance. It starts, for me, I got lucky, frankly, because when I was still in college, I actually kind of became obsessed with the idea of what we now call the internet. Back then, it was other kind of terms for it, and it was really more conceptual. I remember reading a book by Alvin Toffler, who wrote a book called The Third Wave. He also wrote Future Shock and a bunch of other things. He was talking about this notion of sort of a electronic cottage, sort of an electronic frontier, and I was like reading this and thought that's so going to happen. And I just knew it was going to happen. But there were no companies existed that were doing it. So even when I graduated from college, it wasn't like I could go to work for one. There was nobody to go to work for. And so it took a few years to kind of figure out some angle. And on the perseverance part, actually, what got me to move to the Washington, D.C. area, I joined a company in 1983 that had a product called GameLine, which back then, some of you may remember this, most of you probably weren't alive, but back then, almost nobody had PCs, but almost everybody had Atari video game machines. So this idea, this GameLine product, basically was a communications modem plugging into a game machine to turn it into an interactive terminal. I said, finally, I've got my path. This is it. So I moved here, very excited. And the company was well funded by great venture capitalists, Citigroup and Allstate and Kleiner Perkins and a bunch of others. But basically failed. And I remember going to a board meeting. I think it was my first board meeting. I was like, oh, board meeting, cool. And the Kleiner Perkins guy, Frank Caulfield, looked at the sales statistics and said, you'd have thought they would have shoplifted more than that. That was sort of like kind of the end of that company. But we stuck with it, and that team ended up leaving, and 2 years later, starting, what became AOL. So the idea was there, sort of the passion about the idea was there. It had this kind of founding team. A bunch of engineers also joined us in that, and then the perseverance to stick. It really took us easily a decade before we kind of figured it out. So it's not surprising that those are the kind of things that our team at Revolution kind of kind of have a bias towards there. And I even separate now the world of business can be separated into attackers and defenders. The entrepreneurs are attackers. The larger companies, Fortune 500 companies, are defenders. They're actually trying to protect the status quo, and the leaders are trained to sort of de-risk things. They want to grow, but they also mostly don't want to don't want to decline. And it's a different kind of mindset. I realized that as AOL got larger, and certainly after we merged with Time Warner, we kind of shifted from being an attacker company to being a defender company. So I kind of saw that kind of vividly. The world of entrepreneurs, the world of attackers, then gets divided into what I think of as built-to-flip companies and built-to-last companies. And both are important and both are fine. And if you start a company and Instagram and with 12 employees suddenly have tens of millions of users, I guess hundreds of millions of users, and can sell it to somebody for $1 billion, awesome. That's great. You should feel great about that. And there are many examples of that. And there are a lot of people who are creating, I'm sure many in the room, kind of apps or other things with the explicit idea of getting in the market, getting some traction, and selling it to somebody else. And that's the source of innovation, the source of economic vitality, creation of jobs, the source of R&D for these larger companies. That's fine. But I'm more interested in the built-to-last companies that are really going to take a 10-plus year kind of a horizon, attack a problem that is a tougher problem. It's not going to happen overnight. Healthcare and education, there are reasons it hasn't been disrupted. It's because it's hard. It's hard in part because of the status quo and people's kind of comfort zone, part because of the way these markets work are different than other markets. They're more of an institutional market. Consumers don't really make the decisions about healthcare. Somebody else does. They're usually the payer, their employer, or the government, or what have you, is really in the driver of that. If you follow the money is not in the consumer hands, it's in somebody else's hands. If you follow the money in education, the same thing is true. It just means it takes longer to break through. So you've got to have the ability to persevere. So our bias is more on those kind of companies. So Echo 360, you mentioned, we recently invested in, which is actually in the Northern Virginia area. It's working with 600 universities now to help them evolve, to embrace these digital technologies, to improve the learning experience, both before, during, and after class. We think that's important. We think 99% of the students are on campus, 99% of the dollars are on campus, and we should work with those campuses to try to help them move into the kind of the next kind of chapter. So those kind of things are the ones that we tend to be interested in. I should say also, Revolution, we kind of have two sides of the house. One is we call Revolution Ventures, which are earlier stage ventures where we're invest a few $1 million in a team and an idea. Usually they've gotten started, but we generally haven't done the early stage angel kind of thing. But it's still kind of figuring stuff out. And then Revolution Growth, which is investing in a later stage, what we think of as speed-ups, not startups, where we're making bigger investments, $20, $30, $40 million, and taking an idea that is clear, a business model that is clear, and really taking it to scale and trying to take what might be a $20 million company and see if can we make it into a $1 billion company. So there are two different sides of the house, if you will, and I think both are important. Invest in these ideas, on the startup side, but also I think we're, I and Ted Leonsis and Don Davis, the other two partners on the growth side. It's not just writing the check. It's how do you help build these companies, and that's where I think we can add some value.
Wonderful. So looking forward, Jobs Act has been passed. A lot of work on implementation. Kind of some of the same questions that we asked Senator Warner from your perspective as somebody in the private sector working from the public policy standpoint. Startup Act 2.0, other innovations, what do you see as kind of the key things over the next year or two that this community should be sort of rallying around?
Well, the specific one would be Startup Act 2.0. It was introduced by Senator Warner and Senator Coons, two Democrats, and Senator Rubio and Senator Moran, two Republicans, I can't remember, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, something like that. And there's similar bills now in the House. So I think my hope is, like any entrepreneurial optimism, my hope is we could follow the Jobs Act quickly with the Startup Act and get it done. But obviously, as it got closer to November, kind of everything froze because of the election cycle. Well, now it's unfrozen, and trying to get more attention focused on it, I think, is important. I do think, and Senator Warner said this, the immigration issue is now back on the table, and for a while it was kind of on the shelf, waiting for the election result. And if there is a way, as Senator Warner said, of having a broader solution to immigration, that would clearly be better. It's a big issue that's facing the nation. So if there's some version of the DREAM Act or something that could also get done, terrific. But if it can, hopefully it can, but if it can't, moving forward with at least this more limited, discrete immigration related to high-skilled folks is important. And it's crazy that we, as a nation, do such a great job of attracting some of the best and brightest to come to our universities and give them these PhDs and masters. About half of the people at MIT and Carnegie Mellon and so forth are from other nations. And then once we give them these great educations, for the most part, we kick them out, force them to go back to their country, and whether they do, they start companies there that compete with companies here. I mean, everybody kind of agrees it's insane. And indeed, in one of the debates, presidential debates, both President Obama and Mitt Romney both came out in support of essentially modifying the high-skilled immigration rules. So that's, to me, the most important thing to get done. So if it can get done in a reasonably promptly, the next few months in a broader way, fine. If for some reason that's not getting liftoff, then at least let's get the piece around high-skilled immigration done. And the Startup Act also has some other components, including things related to regulation and commercialization. So it's not just about immigration, but that is important. Winning the global battle for talent is important.
One of the core ingredients to sort of success in all of this, as Senator Warner said. So some questions from the audience. Any questions? Come on, guys. Yep.
Well, I'd say, as I say, education and healthcare actually are pretty similar. There's some differences, but pretty similar in terms of their structural challenges. One, as I said, is they're not normal marketplaces. The decisions are made in different ways, not really consumers deciding like what restaurant to go to or what PC to buy. Their decisions are more complicated, and because the money is coming from other kind of sources. The second thing that's similar about them is it's actually kind of hard and confusing to talk about it as a monolithic industry. Education really has multiple sectors and components, and they really have different challenges and different opportunities. So what you do in K-12, for example, is different than what you're doing in higher ed, which is different than what you're doing sort of in training, lifelong learning. They're really different segments, and sometimes they get kind of put under one banner. Healthcare is similar. There's at least 3 industries within healthcare. There is the staying healthy business, some would call that wellness. There's the managing chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth, which is where a lot of the cost is. And there's managing life-threatening disease, cancer, and so forth. They actually are pretty different, and the challenges and the business opportunities and the interventions are actually quite different. So partly it's how do you kind of move from this broad context into a somewhat narrower, more focused context, and then try to understand within each of those what are the different dynamics. So take just higher ed as an example. We talked about Echo 360. I think it's great that there's some new companies that have emerged that are basically saying we're going to allow you to get the benefits of a university education without having to go to a physical place. And Coursera, Udacity, a bunch of people trying to do that. The Khan Academy is in a way trying to do that. I think that's terrific. At the same time, as I said, right now, I think globally, there's 20,000 colleges and universities serving 100 million students. Well, why don't we focus on making their educations better? Let's see what happens over here, but that seems like it's a pretty big opportunity right there. And probably 10 years from now, most people are going to be on campus, and they're going to be in classrooms. So how do you evolve that experience so you provide better learning outcomes more conveniently, lower costs, and so forth? That's sort of in a way to approach it. So trying to understand how do you segment these things, and then what's specifically going on there, and what kind of business opportunities are there? And I think there's dozens of opportunities in each of these, so it's not like there's just one to focus on, but being more crisp in terms of how you define the market and define the problem, I think it can be helpful here.
One more question?
Hi, my name is Courtney Dennis.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely improved. That's not to say there isn't still work to be done, but it's definitely improved. I didn't go back 25 years. When we started AOL, there was no venture capital here, none. We had to go to New York, Chicago, Toronto, and San Francisco to raise our rounds. So it's developed considerably, and the efforts trying with Startup America and Startup DC and so forth, trying to network things together at each of these stages is really important. It's sort of this network density is a critical concept to understand. There actually are interesting things happening, but they're in most regions too disconnected. So there's an important role for integration. There's an important role for innovation. There's an important role for inspiration, kind of the 3 I's, if you will, and trying to focus and try to build on some of the existing things and existing momentum and take them to the next level is really where the action is. So and there are more venture capitalists now that are looking in this region. Some even opening offices here because they sense it's kind of interesting. AOL, we had some success. Probably 100 companies have been started in the area by ex-AOL people. Living Social now is visible nationally, and people are saying, well, that's sort of interesting, and I guess you can build a company like that in DC. Wow, that's how about that? And some people from Living Social will end up starting to go off and start other companies. MCI, when we were getting started, was a big communications company. That led to dozens of communications startups. So some of it is the evolution of the entrepreneurs kind of having one company having some success and then some spin-offs, which then attracts more capital, including from entrepreneurs who are mentoring and sometimes investing in those companies, but that then attracts more institutional capital. And I also believe that it's certainly a focus for us at Revolution, but other firms are starting to figure out this rise of the rest and trying to understand how to be more connected in other regions, because Silicon Valley is a well-stocked pond. There's a lot of fish in that pond. Can't argue that. But there's a lot of people fishing in that pond too. And sometimes fishing in a pond that's a little smaller and have fewer fish, but like if you're the only one, or maybe only 2 or 3 others fishing in that pond, you actually catch more fish there than you will when there's like 1,000 people trying to catch the 500 fish. Maybe it's better to be one of 3 people trying to catch the 20 fish. I mean, there's sort of a arbitrage opportunity there. So I think it's gotten better. It needs to get better still. The purpose of things like this is to get people focused on this and create momentum and interest in the space. And success begets success, and momentum begets momentum. So I'm really quite encouraged. I think DC has made an interesting rise. Actually, in the last decade, Boston has come down a little bit. It's partly because they've gotten a little more risk averse. They kind of shifted from this attacker mentality into a little bit more of a defender mentality. And even some firms that were based there kind of shifted their center of gravity to Silicon Valley or elsewhere. So I think they could come back, but they kind of lost some ground versus where they were, say 10 or 20 years ago. DC has gained a lot of ground. New York has gained a lot of ground. So I think the rising regions, New York and DC, are 2 of the hottest regions now in the country. Thanks to Evan's leadership of Startup.
Thanks to your leadership of this whole organization. Any closing remarks for us, closing thoughts?
The only thing I'd say is it's important. And I think it's important as an entrepreneur, an investor in entrepreneurs, obviously your main focus is going to be on what you're doing, your company, or and that needs to be your main focus. And it's important for that to be successful. So whatever it takes for that to be successful, that is important. But there's 2 other things I think are also important. One is what's happening in your region, in your community, and what role can you play beyond your own sort of selfish focus kind of thing to help the region more broadly, and not just wait for somebody else to do it, but you do it. And if everybody in this room and everybody in rooms like this and DC Week and so forth said, okay, this year I actually am going to spend like 5% of my time just trying to be helpful in the community, either mentoring or investing or hosting an event or something. Just a little bit of my time, that's going to help lift the region, help lift all the boats in the region. And that's a good thing to do, but in the long run, actually, it'll be a good thing for me as an entrepreneur in terms of talent and capital and so forth. So don't be just so narrowly focused on your own thing that at least spend some modest amount of time trying to kind of play a more regional lift all boats kind of mentality. And so get involved in Startup DC or Startup Virginia or Startup Maryland. That's now's the time. We're trying to create, with urgency, create more of this network density. And the last one would be to recognize that, as I said at the beginning, that what you're doing with your company or your region is part of a larger story, and that is the story of America, which is the story of entrepreneurship, and recognize with some pride that the role you're playing is part of what's made our nation great and will continue to make our nation great. It's not just about the product and service you're providing. There's a broader movie unfolding, story unfolding, and you should recognize that you are making a contribution. There are a lot of ways to make a contribution. You can serve in the military, you can join government, you could be a teacher, a lot of different ways to make a contribution. Being an entrepreneur is a way as well, because ultimately our nation is only as strong as our economy is only as strong as our innovation engine, and our innovation engine is going to be driven by entrepreneurs. So the role we all collectively play is what's gives me hope that we can remain the world's most entrepreneurial nation. So kind of look at these three buckets. Focus on your core and try to make sure it's successful. Obviously, that's important. But play a little bit more of a role regionally and understand what you're doing as part of a larger story.
Extremely inspiring. Thank you
so much.
so much.
All right, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Evan, for hosting.
Thank you.
See you later.
Really appreciate it.